being here. And what today's panel is about is the issue that's been going on in Ferguson, and not just Ferguson, but police misconduct and the protests that have been going around the nation. And we've had several hot topics and about this issue, and people came up and they wanted to talk about solutions, what's been going on, and I wanted to invite people that are actually working on some of those solutions that you guys mentioned before, so I think this is a great opportunity. And members of the Ferguson Legal Defense, Ferguson Action, and NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, are here, so I wanted to introduce everyone and give them an opportunity to talk about what they've been doing, how they got involved, and from there, afterwards, any questions you guys have, and I'm sure they'd be love to answer. So we have Professor Justin Hansford, who's with Ferguson Legal Defense Committee. He was a professor at St. Louis University, one of the people that's been on the ground there since the beginning. And then we have Marbury Butts, who is part of Ferguson Action and working with several of the policy initiatives in support of that. Nicole Lee, who is also a member of the Ferguson Legal Defense Committee, and she came down to Ferguson to give also a human rights perspective because of some of these issues that's going on, so she'll be able to touch on that and just the different perspective of the issues that are surrounding the communities. And we also have Leslie Pro, who is the director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the DC branch. And she's been working on several policy initiatives as well with the executive branch and with the Department of Justice. So I'd like to thank them for coming, and we'll start off with Justin.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Marcus and the organizers of this event. I am very honored to be here at Columbus School of Law. I actually went to law school in DC at another school around the corner, Georgetown. But you know, we always considered Columbus sort of a distant cousin, a fellow Catholic Jesuit university, and I teach at one now. So we are all family here, or at least me and you guys. We're family. So thanks for inviting me. So I want to talk briefly about some of the things that have been happening in Ferguson. I live about 10 minutes away from Ferguson. I'm a law professor, St. Louis University School of Law. And like many people, my engagement in Ferguson started out from seeing Mike Brown's body on my timeline on Facebook. And it reminded me of some lynchings. And actually, when I saw that, I immediately thought about the song by Billie Holiday, Strange Fruit. And it was something that brought back many memories for me as someone who was a Black Studies minor at Howard. And I've been engaged in protest ever since. And this is something that, as you know, is not a new problem. The Malcolm X grassroots movement estimates that a Black person is killed by law enforcement every 28 hours here in the United States. And this happens in the context of the prison industrial complex, which has only grown over the course of my lifetime. I was born in 1981, and since 1981 to today, the number of people in America has quadrupled from 500,000 during the time of my birth to 2.3 million today. And of course, we know that part of this is explained by the war on drugs. We look at the statistics, and they're staggering, of course. 14 million white people report using drugs last year. 2.6 million Black people report using drugs. Yet Blacks are imprisoned at 10 times the rate that whites are for drugs. Black people are 12% of the national population and 40% of the prison population. And so this is in a country that is 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. So those numbers don't greatly disturb you, then I don't know what will. And then throw into the mix here what we have on the streets of Ferguson and all around the country, which is a epidemic of racialized policing. And Mike Brown is one particular incident which I'm very familiar with. It comes on the heels of Trayvon Martin. It's followed by Eric Garner and John Crawford and Tamir Rice, and the list goes on. So we're here in the middle of a crisis in America, and I think we all are very privileged to be able to be engaged in trying to solve this crisis. So I was engaged as an organizer. I was someone who went out and protested. I was tear gassed. I was shot with rubber bullets. Luckily, they missed. They didn't miss everyone. I was arrested. I was, there are a number of things that happened that we can go into more detail about later. But what I want to talk to you about is the heroic response, because the ugly part, I think Nicole will talk some more about the ugly part, but there's also a beautiful part of this. This is the response of everyday people who decided that they weren't going to stand for it. We know that this has been happening around the country for years, but in Ferguson, people decided that they were going to respond differently, and it was an honor to be a part of that. So we've been able to, as lawyers and law students, respond and make a difference. So how many of you are lawyers here? Seems like there are a number of lawyers. Yeah, so a number of lawyers are in the crowd in addition to law students. So I particularly want to address you as attorneys and future attorneys, so you can think about how you as an individual can make a difference here. We started out by doing things like doing Know Your Rights sessions in Ferguson, where we would go out to the community and talk to young people there about how they should interact with law enforcement. We had policy discussions in the law school. We created the Ferguson Legal Defense Committee. We did everything, including sue the police for some of their aggression, represented activists who were arrested on false charges. We had some of the police practices overturned as unconstitutional. So there are a number of things that lawyers can do in the courtroom, in the community, in the law school, and throughout their entire lives, not just as people arguing in front of a court and filing briefs to make a difference here. And I want to talk also a little bit about the policy issues that we have been engaged in, and Marbury will talk about that more, and Leslie, I think, as well. But there are a couple of things that I want to make sure I want to address. Number one, body cameras. So there are a number of people, including the President of the United States, who assert that body cameras will make a real difference in the epidemic of racialized policing, and I am completely against body cameras. I'm against body cameras for the most important reason, I guess, I'm against body cameras is because I believe it will contribute to the over-incarceration of black youth. The reality is that those recordings are going to be used more often as evidence against civilians as opposed to being used to have indictments against police officers. And so the over-policing, the broken windows policing will only be enhanced and will have an increase in mass incarceration as a result of videotaping people who aren't even suspects. Don't forget, they'll be videotaping people whether or not they're suspected of any crimes. There are Fourth Amendment concerns, again, for you attorneys and law students, of privacy issues when they walk into places where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy with their cameras on. We don't know how long they're going to keep those recordings. We don't know, when they can turn the camera off and when they're going to be able to turn it back on. So all these issues are prominent in my mind, and on the balance, I think it's a bad idea. So I had a PowerPoint today, which I can't show, but just imagine a long list of bullet points. These would be all the policy proposals that we've seen. We've advocated on state, local, and national levels for change in the city of Alderman, the mayor's office, the state Missouri legislature. Of course, we've come here to Capitol Hill, everybody has an idea. And so what we need to do, I think, is move from the streets to the halls of power and start trying to put some of these ideas into practice to actually have some sort of intervention in racialized policing. So that's one issue that I think we should dismiss, this idea that body cameras will be the solution. Another issue is the epidemic of citizen review boards that are toothless and ineffective, with no subpoena power and no ability to enforce disciplinary procedures or penalties on departments, whether the police chief likes it or not. So we had one of these fake solutions proposed by the Ferguson City Council, where they said, okay, you guys, I see you're protesting, we'll give you a citizens review board. And so when you go down and look at the fine print, you see, aha, that Citizens Review Board is completely advisory. So I think there was a case in New York, as a matter of fact, where a Citizens Review Board had amassed a 700-page report on police misconduct, and the police chief looked at that report and he said, well, I'm going to read it when I get around to it. And over a year later, nothing has been done in that particular situation. So these are the types of fake interventions that people are proposing, and we need to make sure that as lawyers, we look at the fine print, because that's what lawyers are good for in many cases. Looking at the fine print and ensuring that any intervention actually does what we want it to do. So that's the second proposal that we should think more critically about, these proposals that assume that citizen review boards are going to be the solution. I can go on and on. Like I said, there's a long imaginary list here that you can think about. But I want to give everyone else a chance to share their ideas, so I'm going to close. When I had a chance to go to the United Nations with Mike Brown's mother and with other protesters, as an attorney, I was able to make all of the legal arguments that the people in the United Nations wanted to hear, so that we could submit our brief and have our case heard by the global community. But Mike Brown's mother had a chance to testify. And when she spoke, she was able to bring the emotional content that I could never bring. When she talked about having to see her son lying there in the street for over 4 hours. And when she described what it felt like to see the blood running out of his head on the concrete on that hot summer day, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And people from around the world, from all these different countries, acknowledged that, yes, your human rights were violated. Yes, this is a systematic problem in the United States. Yes, African Americans in particular are being targeted for an unequal application of the law. And yes, you are right, your claim is legitimate, and you deserve remedy. And it's a shame that we had to go all the way to Geneva to have our dignity acknowledged and have our claim legitimized. But that's what the case was. State, local, and federal governments failed to respond. And so I'm hoping that as attorneys, we can move our government to engage in transformative responses, not just more of the usual incremental reforms, but transformative responses so that we can live in a country where there's truly equal justice under law. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Again, my name is Nicole Lee, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you today. I want to thank BALSA for putting this together. I specifically want to thank Marcus Banks, who is a real hero in your midst. He answered a call that many said that they would answer when the time came. As a member of Ferguson Legal Defense Committee, we had put out a call, especially around the time when we knew there would be a decision regarding whether or not there would be an indictment against Darren Wilson. And we had put out a call because, as Justin had mentioned, or Professor Hansford had mentioned, we knew that there would be, if the recent history was any indication, there would be significant violations of civil and human rights, because there hadn't been any change in how the unified command in Ferguson, that would be St. Louis City and St. Louis County, how they were going to handle having protesters. So we knew that there would be issues, and so we put out a national call to lawyers and law students to come to Ferguson, and many did come. Many more said they would come, but many did come. And Marcus was one of those that is in your community that heard that call and came. And I remember meeting him. I'd come home for just a few days to see my children and to do a talk in DC, and Marcus came up to me and said, "I'm going to Ferguson," and it was like the day before Thanksgiving. I mean, it was the night before Thanksgiving, and at a time where we needed relief and we needed assistance, this community through Marcus Banks stood up for Ferguson. And so I do want to give that shout out and thank him and thank all of you for inviting us to be here today. I'm one of those folks that answered the call, if you will, for Ferguson. I had been to St. Louis many times. I used to run an organization called Trans-Africa, which is the African American Foreign Policy Organization. And we have chapters all over the country. And so we had a St. Louis chapter in the form of an organization called Organization for Black Struggle, OBS. And so I had been to St. Louis, met a lot with them and done work with them. I'd even traveled to different countries like Venezuela with their founder, Jamila Rogers. So I was familiar. But in August, when Mike Brown was killed, I was kind of on a hiatus, if you will. I'd taken some time off to spend with my children. I had just left Trans-Africa. And while I watched on live stream people being tear gassed in the streets, even though for me, being a person who had been a lawyer, I'd worked in Colombia on the war on drugs on that side, I had done documentation of human rights violations in Haiti after 2 coups. Even with that, I had a really hard time seeing my place in all of it. What did I really have to offer at that moment? I was angry, and I called just about every civil rights organization in this country and said, "What are you guys doing? What is happening? What is going on here?" But I couldn't see my role because I saw myself as being an international human rights lawyer, right? International stuff. So I work on treaties and things called covenants, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And while I truly believe that civil rights are human rights, and I saw for myself the violation of human rights, it was still that momentary pause. How can international human rights play a role here? And it's not just me, right? So if you want to know anything about U.S. treaty obligations, 2015, as it relates to human rights, 2015 is the right year to be thinking about it. This is the year that the U.S. comes up for the Universal Periodic Review within the United Nations. Every country within the United Nations is going to have, I think it's going to average to be 70 seconds. Every country, though, no matter how big, no matter how small, no matter what their GDP is, will have 70 seconds to tell the United States how they can improve their human rights situation. So it's a good year. But when I think about structurally how it actually works in the United States, how is it that citizens from the United States can go to the UN or go to an international body and talk about their human rights violations, you find very quickly there's a structural issue. The whole apparatus is within the State Department. There really is very little within the departments that are really poised to work on quote-unquote civil and human rights. There's very little there. You have to go to the State Department. And I bring this up because it tells you something about how we in the United States, even those of us who are tasked to be thinking about human rights, often get confused. And we forget that it is not just an outward-looking thing. This is not about the US telling other countries how to deal with human rights. It is also really it's really also incumbent upon us to really be thinking about, what do human rights at home really look like? Unfortunately, I think the situation in Ferguson provided a really sad opportunity to realize how important it really is to have an international perspective on what's going on in the United States. And I raise these mechanisms, one, because Justin, I think, very eloquently talked about what happened when the Brown family and Justin and several activists went to the torture committee to talk about what had happened to Mike Brown. But I also think that this is a moment where we have an opportunity to really redefine how we see our rights in this country. And I think international human rights really give us an opportunity. So I ended up going, heeding the call, and I talked to several people in St. Louis County, and finally someone said, "You don't really seem to understand. We actually need someone," because I had all sorts of excuses why, it should be somebody else, and I wasn't really needed. They said, "What we need is someone who's been in a country that is considered really scary. We need that person to come to St. Louis County and document like you were documenting in one of those countries. And Haiti, Colombia seemed to fit the bill, so could you please just get on a plane?" So I went, and when I arrived, it was the first day of the state of emergency that was put in place by Governor Nixon. And what I saw completely confused me, because I've seen tanks rolling down the streets before. I've seen police just throw people to the ground with extreme prejudice and arrest them for walking down the street. I've seen all of that before. These are not new scenes to me. I think what was new, and I'm going to make a joke, but I'm actually very serious, is that it all happened with Target signs behind us, and Walmart, and McDonald's. These weren't foreign places. This was in the suburbs and in the cities of the United States of America that we were seeing scenes that were really akin to scenes that we have seen in Baghdad and Kabul and in other places where we believe human rights violations take place. I very soon after met Justin, and we began to talk, and one of the things that was really amazing to me was how many lawyers had actually been arrested for just walking down the street with the little green cap that shows that they're lawyers. I actually haven't been in many countries where people target lawyers. So the idea that the police in the United States of America would purposely target lawyers that are signifying that they are civil and human rights lawyers was really shocking to me. So we did things like wrote letters to the DOJ, but then we also started thinking we need to really be writing letters internationally as well. So within the UN system, there are these people called special rapporteurs, and there's many different special rapporteurs. Some represent freedom of assembly, some of them represent freedom of expression, freedom against torture. We wrote them letters as well and said we're very concerned that the situation is going to get out of hand here. The night that the indictment came down, and I think the way Professor Hansford said I was going to talk about some of the ugly things that happened, and I will talk about some of those. The night that the decision came down, there was a lot of concern, especially since during the day, so many of the lead activists had already been arrested and were being held without charge. People don't talk about that the people that had actually been gathering together, doing the nonviolent direct action trainings, those that had the confidence of the community, were actually targeted by the police for arrest, which caused confusion, and it absolutely caused anger. That evening, Justin and I drove our car. We parked right in front of the Ferguson Library. You may have seen that on television. We parked right in front of there, and we walked down to Ferguson PD after we heard on our car radio the announcement by the District Attorney McAuliffe that everyone had heard, whether they listened on their phone or from their cars. They had heard, and people were upset, in part because it was not only just the announcement, there was also, if you heard it, it was a little bit of a slap in the face. Basically what he said was, I never should have had to do this process anyway, because I already knew what the outcome would be. People were angry. From watching CNN that my husband so graciously taped for me, since we couldn't see it at Ferguson PD, I think that there are two important things you have to understand about what happened that evening. One is, if you remember, as the president spoke, there was the picture of fires being set and people being tear gassed. Do you all remember this? People were being tear gas was being thrown, and then these fires were being lit. One of the things that's interesting after being on the ground was that Justin and I were being tear gassed. We got separated because we were literally running for our lives, because as we were being tear gassed, we were also being shot with rubber bullets, and there were vigilantes on rooftops shooting, and we weren't sure whether they were shooting rubber bullets or not. So us and about, 2,000, 3,000 of our then friends were running virtually for our lives. And as I was crouching in a corner with a young man who had just come home from college, because it was Thanksgiving weekend, and he had been tear gassed, and we're spraying Malox in his eyes because he can't walk and he's vomiting. We're doing all this, and we're also looking at our phones because we're trying to figure out where we can go. Because now you can't be a lawyer, you can't document, you're literally running away from danger. People saying, get away from the fires. And I remember looking up. You remember, Justin was like, where are the fires? What CNN didn't tell you was where all of the protesters actually were. And this is why documentation is so important, frankly. There were no fires. The fires happened, it's about a 25 to 30-minute walk away from where the actual protesters were at Ferguson PD. So there was actually really no reason for that level of attack. It wasn't as if there was tear gas being thrown because there was destruction of property or people were being harmed. The tear gas was a method, and I've seen this happen in other countries, it was a method of coercion. It was a method to frighten. It was a method to show dominance. And frankly, that is what they did and what happened. Oftentimes when I tell that tale, I think in the back of my head, oh my gosh, these folks, they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is impossible. How could that have happened? Maybe she's mistaken. Well, I will tell you that I have a couple friends on my side with this. Federal judge in Missouri agreed with us. Justin and I and our colleagues brought a request for an injunction against the Unified Command to use those sorts of tactics again, and the judge completely agreed that the tactics were out of control and unnecessary, and we still have a standing temporary restraining order against the Unified Command that has actually now been disbanded, but it's parts, if you will, so St. Louis County, St. Louis City. That sort of scenario repeated itself. The police tear gassed a restaurant where people were eating. And then as people tried to run from the tear gas, they were shot with rubber bullets or arrested, again, with extreme prejudice, slammed on the ground, really, treated very roughly. And then the subsequent days, some of the methods still continued, including picking up activists, known activists, holding them without charge, and really frightening them. And there was one situation in particular that we covered where two activists, one is an ACLU trainer, was in a car with two other activists. 6 police cars, unmarked police cars, pull up. They don't know if it's the Ku Klux Klan. The DOJ was very clear with us. Ku Klux Klan was everywhere and very well armed. They didn't know who it was. They were pulled out of their car at gunpoint. Guns were put to their head. When the young woman who was the ACLU trainer asked, "Are we being detained?" because that is how she was trained, she was told, "There is a gun to your effing head. What do you think?" This is the people who are supposed to protect and serve, and this is how these young people were treated. The 2 young men were arrested and held without charge until lawyers like myself showed up, and we were able to get them released. Very dangerous situation if you think about it. What would have happened if the gun had discharged by accident? That young woman is someone's mother and someone's child as well. What about those 2 young men? What if these arrests go wrong? I mean, is this another situation? And one of the things our activists are constantly told in Ferguson is, you're about to be another hashtag. Can you imagine living under those conditions? These are the sorts of conditions you think about when you think about other countries. And again, in this story, right, people don't necessarily want to hear it, but one of the people who did want to hear it was President Obama, because one of the young men that was detained in that awful manner was invited to the White House actually a few days later to tell that story. As you would think that someone in another country, a human rights defender in another country would be invited. There are major structural issues in St. Louis County, and this is not to other St. Louis County, but to show that there are, significant issues that need to be addressed. For 900,000 people in St. Louis County, there are 400,000 outstanding warrants. So either the people of St. Louis County are just criminals, or there's a structural problem. A part of it is that 60% of some of their municipalities' budget, there's 93 municipalities, up to 60% of the budget comes from tickets, traffic tickets. If you don't pay your traffic tickets, a warrant is issued for you. I've met young men that have 10 warrants for basically the same offense, like their registration was expired. Major structural issues. When they go before a judge, that judge may have been a prosecutor the day before, and the prosecutor may be the judge the next day. It's a municipal court structure. But for a place that has almost 1 million people, it's completely inappropriate. A place that has maybe 500 people, they may have a municipal court structure because there's not that many lawyers. But here, in an area that has almost 1 million people, it's a disgrace. And frankly, working with the American Bar Association in countries like the Central African Republic, we have actually taken away money from countries like Central African Republic for less, meaning they've had actually better structures than St. Louis County, and yet they have been sanctioned for it. To close, because I know Marbury is going to get up, I would just say that one of the things that Michelle Alexander, I feel like I'm learning so much, right? So I am not an expert on U.S. civil rights. I say that willingly. I am a person who has worked quite extensively on international human rights. I'm learning a lot. And I'm learning from folks like Michelle Alexander, who have been kind of crying out there for a long time and saying we have some structural issues that need to be addressed. One of the things that she said after she wrote The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, is that there's going to be nothing short than a mass mobilization, a mass human rights movement in the United States that will change the structure. And I truly agree with her. I truly agree with her. Some of this stuff is entrenched. Often those of us who are people of color, who have been able to get an education, who have been able to actually, quote unquote, make it, we even disregard these structures. We believe that somehow because we have made it, that it must be okay, that everybody else should then be able to make it. I don't believe in that. And I don't believe that anyone that considers themselves a civil or a human rights lawyer should buy into that at all. I think we need to be talking about changing the structure from within and demanding, like Justin does, from every single corner, whether it's the courtroom or whether you're in handcuffs. That is our role. That is our responsibility as lawyers today. Thank you.
It's always hard to go after Nicole, so bear with me. How y'all doing today? Good? Good. So I was asked to speak briefly about Ferguson Action and kind of how that got started and also the kind of policy side of that. So I'm going to try and keep it quick because I'm really interested in folks' questions. But so Ferguson Action was actually formed in Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed. And what happened was a lot of people kind of descended on Ferguson and St. Louis in reaction to what Nicole and Justin have described. And those were folks who have been part of different movements. And I think this is a really important point of we've watched in my lifetime. I remember Rodney King. I remember Ramarley Graham in New York. I remember Trayvon Martin, that we've seen in our lifetime over and over again, that occasionally the national attention is grabbed by the killing of our sons and our daughters in these very explicit ways that are completely never punished or not fully punished. And so I think that there's been a movement that to Justin's point goes to a time even before we were born, when lynching happened and when other things were happening. And this really is, I think, a modern day lynching in lots of ways. But there's been a development of a movement over decades. And in my lifetime, there's been these flashpoints. And I think what we often forget is when the media leaves and folks forget about what's going on, in fact, the organizing, the outrage that is instigated by these deaths, by these these killings remains. And so I think, especially since Trayvon Martin, there's been these networks of folks who have been really, really, really angered and have felt completely isolated from the criminal justice system and have been organizing locally, organizing in their communities, organizing with their people. And so when Michael Brown was killed, and before that, Eric Garner, I'm from Brooklyn, so that was what happened in New York, I think those networks were activated. But the power of that, the power of organizing, the fact that when these things happen, even when the media leaves, that folks are still invested and folks are still really putting in the work to kind of be ready for moments like this. And so in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death, a lot of folks who had been organizing for years around these issues, who had watched in their own communities, whether it was Ohio or New York City or Los Angeles, had watched how this plays out, had watched young black men and women be killed, and then had watched the justice system completely fail in the light of that. Well, incredibly, I think, were catalyzed by that. And many of them came to Ferguson and St. Louis and worked with local folks like Justin and others and developed the Ferguson Action Network. And that was really, it was in the aftermath, folks were down there and they were kind of experiencing these these really war conditions and felt both the need to speak on that, to tell their side of the story, but also to organize around it. And so there was a series of phone calls. That's how it kind of started, like these national calls where folks would share out what was happening on the ground in Ferguson. Both to inspire folks and to kind of educate folks and to speak to what needs there were and what needs there were not. And so it started out as this kind of coordinating effort, and I think grew more and more into an effort to cultivate. And so what we saw, and it was an incredibly bloody summer, right? And so in Staten Island, we had the choking death on camera of Eric Garner. We had John Crawford, who was shot in Walmart. We had Azell Ford, who was shot in the back of the head on the street in Los Angeles, and there was no grand jury even called for that case. And so we saw over and over again both known and unknown folks who really were the victims of state violence, who were met with total impunity. And so folks all over the country were incredibly activated by that, and I think unsure what to do, because the truth is that the state, which both does the policing and the criminal justice side of this, is a huge target, right? It's this it's a holistic, it's huge, and it's every place. And how you can, as an individual or as an organization or as a community, begin to fight against systemic state violence is a real challenge that requires coordination and unity. And so I think a lot of different networks kind of started to really figure out and think about ways to address the systemic state violence in an effective way. And so Ferguson Action was one of those networks, and was based both in Ferguson and across the country, and had these calls and was trying both to kind of support new leadership, because one thing we saw that was incredibly inspiring was folks who had never been to a protest, who had never been out in the streets, who really who saw this, because I think so much of this happens in darkness, right? That these killings and the ways in which black bodies are treated by the state is so often something that is invisible to most people, even black folks who live in different communities. And so both the exposing of that reality and the organizing around it was it was a moment for that. It was this explosion for that. And so what we saw was around the country, folks really wanted to take action. They wanted to do something to express this anger and this frustration, and to just say that this is enough, that this stops today. And so Ferguson Action tried both to kind of connect folks who had been organizing for years, sometimes for decades, around these issues, but also to cultivate and encourage folks who had never been in the streets before, who really wanted to make a statement but weren't exactly sure how. And so this really kind of cultivated around, or kind of culminated around the non-indictment. And so around the non-indictment, Ferguson Action and a few other groups helped plan and coordinate and support and then elevate actions that were happening across the country. And we saw in the wake, and I think it's been described kind of the horrific stuff that happened in St. Louis and in Ferguson, but in the wake of the announcement, we saw over 250 cities across the country who had some type of action, whether it was a shut it down action, whether it was a protest, whether it was a die-in, that we saw people in Wichita, Kansas, in small towns and in huge cities like New York City, refuse to be silent in the face of kind of what was happening, and in the face of what was happening locally, but also what was happening nationally. And so I think that it was an incredible moment for that. And I live in New York City. I live in Brooklyn. And in Brooklyn, we saw more than 50,000 people go into the streets for a march. We saw sustained actions for more than 3 weeks. And for me, to this point that's being made, it was so clear, and the first time in my lifetime where we were in the middle of a movement, right? That it was not just a moment, it was a movement. And that people, the emperor has no clothes on. And so we saw both in St. Louis County, where folks can make all sorts of rationalizations why that's not their city, but also in New York City, where we have a man caught on tape choking another man to death. and yet there's still no indictment. So I was a defense attorney briefly, and so that was especially shocking, and not shocking, but perhaps devastating, because I saw every single day hundreds of black men go through that very system for less evidence and for less serious offenses. And so it was so obvious, the hypocrisy of the system we live in. I think that it really ignited the entire nation, and again, not just huge cities, but also small towns, because this type of violence is incentivized, as Justin and Nicole have talked about, both in large cities and in small towns, whether it's by police policy, whether it's by municipal finances, that we really have incentivized racism and cruelty against black people in this country, especially poor black people who are rendered invisible by other systems, right? So Ferguson Action, kind of in the wake of both the announcement of the non-indictment in Ferguson and then also in New York, issued out calls to action and also supported folks who were trying to do those calls. So provided organizing material, provided support for local activists who wanted to have an action but weren't sure where to start. So kind of in that wake, we tried to support that, and were incredibly moved and excited by how many folks took to the streets and kind of took that call. And as part of that, we also formulated a kind of platform of demands. And there's a beautiful quote that power seeds nothing without a demand. And so I think to this point, and Justin talked briefly about this, but we've seen over and over again in the wake of Rodney King in Los Angeles, we saw this. We've seen this after Molly Graham in New York, that people propose solutions that in fact further entrench the problem. And so body cameras, I think, is a very powerful example in that body cameras create a surveillance state, right? And create a type of policing that's based on surveillance that we've already seen as a weapon that's used against our people in our communities. And so the idea of, like, you have to claim your victory and claim your demands and look at the fine print, I think it's a really powerful point in this moment, because I think so often these movements are co-opted by demands that are not, or by solutions that don't actually address the root problem, which is white supremacy and systemic racism, right? Like that is the root of, and poverty is the root of so much of this, and any problem or any solution that doesn't get to that doesn't speak to that, is not, in fact, a comprehensive solution. And so we developed a series of demands, and some of those demands, we called them tactical demands and then visionary demands, because I think there was a lot to be done at this moment. There are things that Congress, that city councils, that mayors, that police chiefs can do today that will result in less people dying, that will result in less deaths. But there also is a systemic change that has to happen, a revolution of sorts, a transformation that has to occur, where we value and we feed and we facilitate and we cultivate black and brown communities in this country. So I'm gonna just quickly kind of go through the demands and then talk briefly about kind of the ways in which we're trying to implement and to actualize them. So the 6 visionary demands were an end to all forms of discrimination and a recognition of our human rights, which I think folks have spoken to. Also the end of police brutality, full employment for our people, decent housing, the end of the school-to-prison pipeline, the end of the prison industrial complex, right? So this is very, very wide. But I think speaks to both the educational and the poverty and the ways in which these systems buttress themselves and how they all they work together, right? So for instance, we have 1033, which is the program that militarizes police in more than 30 school districts across the country. So we see the ways in which education and criminalization and policing happen in each of these spheres and create both a pipeline, but also a reinforcing system. We also came up with a series of 6 tactical demands. And so these were demands where we were like, there is some stuff you can do today that will change the way policing happens. And it won't address the root causes, but it will allow us to address some of the symptoms. And so that included the demilitarization of police across the country, including school districts, please, but also police departments. It also included a DOJ review of all police departments' data collection mechanisms, as well as excessive use of force. And the idea behind that is the DOJ gives more than $250 million a year to local police departments. And so in many ways funds this war against our people, and that doesn't include the millions in equipment that is given. That is just like, here's some money for y'all. And so the idea of that money has to come with some kind of check. Like there must be, and there can legally be, a check on the way that money is spent. And so if the DOJ develops best practices and then conditions funds on those practices, it has some control over how local departments do its business. There was also the repurposing of funds, so the idea that the cops department out of DOJ gives millions of dollars to departments for community development, but gives no money to communities for that. And so the idea that like real community input is born out of well-financed and well-funded communities who have the power and who have the finances who can actually engage in that process, and not the police departments training themselves to be nicer, right? That there was the community involvement is about communities and therefore requires investment in communities. And there was also congressional hearings on criminalization of black and brown people. And so really having a national conversation, not just about individual incidences of violence, but about the ways in which from the time our children are born to the time that they die, that there is a criminalization that happens across the board, whether it's in their school, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in their jobs, that we see it every place. And so a real national conversation about that phenomenon. The last one was a national plan of action. And this idea comes out, I think, very much of a human rights framework in some way, but the idea that it is the president's job to address the full scope of this problem and develop a national plan of action that's legislative, that's executive, that really touches on each of the spheres from education to employment to healthcare that feed into this devaluing, dehumanization that allows for this moment to even happen. And so we put forward these demands, and I think really the point was to address kind of the need to have a vision of what we want this to look like. That we are in a moment, and this is like one of the more exciting parts for me, is I think for the first time in a long time, we're discussing not just the practices of policing, but also the purpose. So is policing meant to control us? Is it meant for social control? Is it about safety? Like, why is it that we give sometimes over 80% of our municipal budgets to having folks with large guns occupy some neighborhoods and leave other neighborhoods alone? Like, what really is the purpose behind policing? And is the purpose of policing, if it's to keep us safe, is that being honored by the way that we police in this country? And I think that's a really powerful conversation that's really based in communities. And so towards that end, we've developed kind of a series of local demands and also support kind of local campaigns. And so policing, I think, as you all must know, thank you to federalism, is really a local issue, right? That how states and cities decide to police, how much money they put into policing, some of the rules and regulations around policing really are based in local decisions, both state and municipality decisions. And so I think one of the key things, like one of the themes that we have in the demands that we're putting forward is this idea that communities have to decide the practices and the purposes of policing. And to Justin's point, that's not because you form a committee that can give advisory opinions and write long reports, right? It's really about communities having a say in what police do and don't do. And so for us, I think that's three main things. One is a CCRB, which is the Civilian Review Complaint Board, that has power to discipline its officers, because discipline is the heart of the culture of police, that if you have the control to say, you did this and therefore you're fired, you change the very culture of how police departments operate. The other one is capital funding. And so if communities have a say in how police budgets are used, they get to prioritize what makes them safe and what doesn't, right? So that they actually have a say in kind of how policing happens and what's prioritized in policing. And the other kind of major local push that we're trying to support folks doing is the divest invest. So the idea that we in this country presently spend in most municipalities more than half of our budget on policing. And that's insane, right? Like, as we've seen education cuts, as we've seen like benefits for employment cuts, as we've seen like a lack of universal health care, a lack of universal child care, like the things that we know actually in the long term prevent crime and make us safer, we've divested in all of those things over the last 30 or 40 years. And we've invested both nationally and internationally in a bigger police force and more guns. And so just the idea that really we have to think as a nation about what it is that we want to invest in and who we're investing in, and divest from things that make us less safe and make us less human in some ways. And I think the other kind of key thing that Ferguson Action has tried to do and is tried to support folks doing is to really imagine the world they want to live in. That we're at this kind of crossroads. We're at this moment where the emperor has no clothes on. And we've seen both militarization of police and policing for what it is. And this is in the middle of now a 5-year conversation about criminal justice more generally. That we have 1/3 of black men will be in a cage at some point in their life. Like, that is a reality in this country. And so we're at a point, I think, where we really have the privilege to reimagine what it is that we think the police state and the state should be doing for our people in our community. And so kind of taking advantage of that, both in terms of envisioning your community differently, but also in terms of really kind of supporting alternatives to policing and incarceration in a meaningful way. And so that's both about community development, it's about organizing, but it's also about divestment and kind of passing laws and at the local level that change the nature and the investment of policing locally. So we've also done some national stuff. I mentioned kind of our national demands, and I think that the kind of thought is that nationally there's a lot to be done around conversations, that we should be talking about this issue, but because so much of it is local, it's important to do what we can nationally and then really invest in organizing locally to push change. And when you see over 250 cities across the country kind of have outbursts, whether they're sustained outbursts or protest or sit-ins or die-ins, that there really is a will behind that. And like changing it, like going through city council or through local governments to make changes is a real possibility. And we've seen that happen in dozens of states across the country or cities across the country have adopted data provisions. I think one of the major things that we haven't touched on because it's super unsexy is the need for data, right? So that there really is no comprehensive database about who's been killed by the police, and so we have this Malcolm X number, which is probably it's probably less than it actually is. Although it's interesting, once every 28 hours is more than the amount of lynchings that happened at the height of lynchings, and so even this very conservative number is still a horrifying one. But there is a real need, both locally and nationally, to kind of take account of what the situation is. Like what is, and in New York, we passed a series of bills in the 90s, and in New York City, the stop and frisk, which is a practice, unconstitutional practice, where police stop folks in certain neighborhoods and pat them down and ask them questions for no reason. We found that over 90% of folks who are stopped are black and brown. And so when we take count of the numbers, they are almost always shocking, that police in this country have been trained and incentivized so that they actually they are rewarded when they stop people, they're rewarded when they arrest people, are incentivized to discriminate. And so really getting at the heart of that, changing the metrics of evaluation and having an honest conversation based in data about the way that this country discriminates, I think is a really important kind of moment. So that's kind of the policy moment. I'm gonna really briefly just talk about kind of what people can do and kind of what folks are doing. So I was in law school when Trayvon Martin was killed. I was also in law school when Romali Graham was killed. Do you all know about Romali Graham? Nah? No? Okay, so Romali Graham was a 22-year-old in New York City who was walking down his block in the Bronx. There were two police officers following him. They were in plain clothes. He walked into his home, and they followed him into his home. They then bust into his home after he walked in and followed him to the bathroom where he was trying to dispose of 0.5 gram of marijuana, and they shot him twice in the head in his own bathroom in front of his 7-year-old brother and his grandmother. And this was a case that happened almost 3 years ago. I think it's 3 years ago, actually, 2 days ago, in the Bronx in New York City. And it was a case where he wasn't suspected of anything. He had marijuana on him, but there was no reason for the cops to shoot him except for that they were profiling him. And it was a rookie cop, which very often in New York City when someone's shot, everyone says, oh, it was a rookie cop, as if that's justification for it. But what we've seen is that there's been no indictment whatsoever. Romali Graham's mother is Constance Graham and has been kind of at the forefront of this movement since her son died. But I was in law school when that happened, and I remember vividly feeling incredibly powerless. And the same with Trayvon Martin. And I felt powerless, I think, for 2 reasons. One was the confines of law school, that you're in this place where you get all this information and you like learn so much, but it also very often I think feels intangible. Kind of what do you do with that? And like how do you use those tools? And I was also incredibly frustrated because of the law. Because I had watched all of these defendants go through this system and we were totally powerless to stop them and being sentenced to 5 years for a drug offense. And yet this man could kill somebody in broad daylight in front of his brother and have no punishment. And there was a chant that folks often chant, which is the whole damn system is guilty as hell. And I think I really had that feeling of like there was no, like what is the way out of this? Like how can we even address this when there's such an injustice and a hypocrisy in this? And the last few months have been so inspiring, I think, because of lawyers like Nicole and Justin, who have really used the law, even its limitations, to do incredibly powerful things. And law is really the language of power. It's what folks speak in places where they make decisions. And so the ability, I think, to really engage with this language, but also to keep your head where you come from and where your heart is, and democratize access to the law, but also how we talk about it, is an incredibly powerful tool. That this is a moment when folks all over the country can use that translation and that language, and how can we kind of support those movements and be part of that democratization, I think is a really exciting moment. So thank you all so much for having me. I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Leslie Prohl, and I'm head of the Washington office of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I'm so honored to be invited to such to join such a stellar panel. All three of you all are very hard to follow. And thanks to Marcus, I wanted you to know, professors in the room, that when he wrote me an email and invited me to come to the panel, it was so compelling and so kind of well written, and I had to say yes immediately. How could I say no to this? So you've got a superstar in your midst here. And also hello to our longtime colleague, Professor Malveaux, who's a very good friend with the Legal Defense Fund. So first of all, I just have to say this, since I'm in the DC area and this is a law school, that we have internships at the DC office of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And frankly, we don't see enough Catholic students in our office. We get a lot of Howard, we get some Georgetown, some GW, but you should definitely apply. And we are actually looking for people right now to work on these issues. We desperately need help. And you talk about being in law school when this is happening. We need any hours that you have, that you want to devote. We can give you credit. We don't have any money, but we can give you credit, and you'll be working with great people. So I just wanted to bring that message to you since I was here. So the Legal Defense Fund has, been working on criminal justice issues since our founding by Thurgood Marshall in 1940. We really kind of address race at every point of the criminal justice spectrum, from racial profiling to discrimination in jury selection to bias in sentencing. And so, as Justin said, what happened in early August was nothing new to us. It's something that we were very familiar with. It's an incredibly frustrating phenomenon that we have watched over and over again. But I think, as everybody here recognized, that this was very different immediately. And I was in DC at the time. If you're in Washington, you know that essentially is the slowest week in the entire year, because Congress has just left and everybody leaves town. And frankly, there were a lot of federal officials who were on vacation, who I think had to change their plans and come back because of everything that was going on. So, we immediately realized that this was something unprecedented, and as well as an opportunity. And I want to tell you a little bit about kind of how our organization approached this, and then talk about specifically what we've been trying to do at the federal level around these issues. We immediately kind of created a strike force within the organization that involved not only our leadership, Sherilyn Eiffel, you probably saw her, she was on television quite a bit in August about this, but kind of all the way down, and then with different representatives of our different project areas. We had communications people on, we had litigators on it, we had policy people on it. And we also did not just have our criminal justice lawyers on it, we had our political participation lawyers, because immediately we realized what is going on in Ferguson when you have a overwhelmingly African American town and there is such little representation on the local governing bodies. What is wrong with that? And so we engaged our voting rights people, we engaged our education people. Michael Brown apparently had gone to a high school that was unaccredited, and in every major city city, around the country, there is a desegregation history. And so we were very concerned about how students down there were getting educated, what kind of the problems were. We also involved our economic justice team. You know, we heard early on how many African American police officers were on the force, virtually none, or 3 maybe. But then also the housing issues. It was a very segregated town, and you know, we wondered, you know, how was this created? And so we kind of amassed that brain trust and kind of moved forward to address issues of essentially transparency and accountability at the local, state, and national levels. And, you know, we have organizers that went to Ferguson, and we had attorneys that went to Ferguson. I never was able to make the trip, but we had people on the ground kind of working with the legal community, with the organizing community on the ground to kind of ferret out the local issues that we might be involved in, really from the perspective of kind of the law and kind of the legal contribution. But not only that, I mean, we'd like to think that we were partnering with the community organizations to push for change at the local level and also the state level. There were a lot of things that we were doing, frankly, some of them behind the scenes with what was going on at the state level, and then certainly at the national level, which is what I wanted to focus on primarily here today. So the you know, challenge that we faced at the kind of local, I mean at the federal advocacy level, was really, you know, how do we use this moment to push through some systemic changes? And since I'm in a law school, I thought I would kind of pose this as an educational question, and you know, kind of talk about with what the issue that was raised about policing, you know, is really a local issue. They are, you know, it is local governance, local municipalities hire the police forces and the chiefs, and there are 18,000 separate police agencies around the country. And so what is the role of the federal government? Kind of where are the pressure points that we can address to promote more transparency and accountability and some responsibility for these acts at the local level? And there's really kind of 2 things that we came up with that I wanted to talk about first, very specifically relating to the Justice Department, is kind of where we focused our sights first. And I circulated the packet of our materials, some examples of the advocacy that we've done at the federal level. And importantly, I think we started with this letter that we wrote to the Attorney General very early on, within a week of the incident, asking for some systemic reforms. And let me just say, I think the Attorney General has just done, you know, a remarkable job through all of this. And he's been, you know, incredibly responsive and responsible and kind of visionary and kind of leading on this charge. And so, you know, I think it was important to start with him. We did not end it there, but I wanted to kind of let you know that we thought that there was a lot more that the Justice Department could be doing. And we asked for a comprehensive and thorough review of police-involved assaults and killings, and I'm going to get to this a little bit later, but the data issue that was raised before is a huge one, when we realized that there's really nowhere to look to see kind of how these are documented, what became of them. You have to essentially search newspapers to find out what the results of investigations were. There's kind of no central place to look at that. And so that's something we focused on very early. We also wanted strong incentives for racial bias training and avoiding the use of force. We asked for holding police officers accountable to the full extent of the law. And Justin, I also have to tell you, we asked for encourage the use of body-worn cameras. We talk about kind of the measures that ought to accompany that use to provide some of the protections that you raised in terms of your concerns. But we did weigh in on that issue. And so we wrote that first letter. And I should also say that, you know, we're working as an organization, but we also worked in a coalition of other national civil rights organizations, which is a very formidable group. It's the Lawyers Committee, the Leadership Conference, the Urban League, the NAACP. We talk very frequently. We didn't want kind of every organization setting out on its own path to try to resolve these issues. You know, we maintain certainly some independence and decide what we can best contribute to the dialogue and to the process, but we also want to make sure we're talking to one another so that we know what other people are doing. We bring the strength in terms of our legal perspective, our history, our knowledge of criminal justice issues. Other people bring a lot of other strong components to the effort. So there's a unity statement in your package that we issued very early and that I think is still accepting sign-ons for some general principles that we were all asking for at the very beginning. And so I just wanted to give you an example of that. And the other thing we did, and I don't know if we included it or not, but I thought it was something very important, kind of going back to my point in terms of who we involved within the organization and what the issues were going to be that we looked at in Ferguson, not just how the police were treating the African American community, but we did something called Ferguson in Focus, and you can find it on our website. If I did not include it, our website's www.naacpldf.org, and it looked at kind of the structural forces in voting, in housing, in education that kind of created to combined to kind of create the Ferguson that exists today, which is something that Ferguson is certainly not alone in terms of those inequities that exist right now and in the recent past. And so it was very interesting for us to kind of look at what combination of forces led to it looking the way that it does today. So the two things that we've really been focused on with the Department of Justice since we wrote that letter are the first has to do with what's already been mentioned about kind of the money that the federal government provides to local police agencies. It's a huge kind of hook, I think, to promote meaningful change. Police forces are very dependent upon federal funds. There's a grant called the Edward Byrne program. It's known as the JAG program, and it funds local police agencies with an amount of $500 million annually. It's the largest source of federal funding for local law enforcement. And so there is the link here that if the federal government is giving these local agencies money, there ought to be strings attached. And there are strings already attached. And our view is that there ought to be additional strings attached that go to monitoring of what the police are doing with respect to communities of color, what training is being conducted, what type of monitoring and oversight is there the data collection that I talked about. Can there more data be collected as a result of just getting that federal funding? I'm not going to bore you, even though this is a law school and I think you could handle it, but there are a lot of, I think, obstacles, I am told, to adding many more conditions to that funding, whether some of it comes through Congress. They call it formula funding, so it's hard for justice to change it itself, and so we have to go to Congress for that as well. But you know, we're saying that if there's a mechanism for controlling waste to make sure that local police agencies aren't engaging in duplicative spending, well, then there ought to be some mechanisms that can be adopted to make sure that they're not discriminating against the people that they're supposed to be protecting. And so that's something that we've been focused on with the department, and we're trying to kind of talk to them about kind of every possible additional measure that could be adopted within the kind of paradigm that exists now to provide more transparency and accountability at the local level. And the second thing is, you won't be surprised to hear that we're the nation's oldest civil rights organization, legal organization, is just straight up civil rights enforcement. There is been a lot of attention on the Civil Rights Division, obviously, within the Justice Department, and kind of the two ways they come at it is they could bring civil rights violation charges against the officer himself, and we've heard a lot of kind of rumors about kind of what they're gonna do on that, and the possibilities in any of these instances. There's also the ability to bring a pattern and practice case against the local department. And that's something that they've done. They've actually, in the Obama administration, they've actually stepped that up quite a bit. I think they've opened 20 pattern and practice cases against local police agencies in the past 5 years, and some of them you may remember in Arizona and New Orleans, and they just settled that one in Cleveland that got quite a bit of attention. So that they're able to do that as well. But there is another office in the Justice Department that we have really focused on, and that is the Office of Civil Rights within the Bureau of Justice Programs. And that is the office that supposedly monitors civil rights issues with respect to all of the money that the federal government has flowing to the local agencies. It's a very specific office with a specific charge, and they have a great website where they talk about kind of what they do in terms of their investigations and their connection to the state agencies that in turn can monitor the local agencies, and then they also have direct connection to the local law enforcement. And so we thought that was a real opportunity to try to make sure that they are enforcing the law to the full extent of the law. And so we've been talking to them, and I think that we're going to continue to talk to them. The idea is that they're not only dealing with complaints. It's not a complaint-driven process. They can kind of affirmatively investigate agencies. I think that people also should know that they can file complaints with that agency, that it's very different from the Civil Rights Division. They work certainly with the Civil Rights Division, but it's kind of a separate lever, a separate hook that we've got. And we're going to be doing some more in terms of making sure people know more about this particular office and kind of what we think it might bring to bear on this whole process. And so some of the things that we're talking about is, having more rigorous training. And it's not just training to eliminate racial bias, which is certainly important, and it's not, it's explicit and implicit bias, but it's also training about use of force, de-escalation methods, how do you deal with mentally ill persons. All these things, in our view, could be stepped up and could be kind of more emphasized at the local level. And then, again, it's the data. It was mentioned, but we're a civil rights legal organization. We bring a lot of cases. A lot of our systemic cases are based on data. On school desegregation cases, school to prison pipeline cases, you have to have the data that's usually available from the federal government. It just doesn't exist when it comes to this issue. It is something that I did not work in this issue. I think we were all appalled when we realized kind of what is not out there available to see. And it's a huge problem. There's no mandatory collection requirements. Apparently, it's all voluntary. Apparently, states can impose different requirements so that it can vary from state to state. So I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of get our arms around this data issue and decide how we want to move forward as a nation, starting with, you need transparency in order to promote accountability. And so I think you said it, I mean, you used my words, it's not sexy, but it's absolutely necessary as a starting point on this issue. So that is kind of the what we've been working on with respect to the Justice Department. I wanted to just, I know we wanted to leave time for questions, but I wanted to kind of say two other things in terms of some places where there's opportunity for reform. And certainly there's the kind of executive as a whole. You know, the president has been very much trying to lead us in a direction of adopting some reforms. He has initiated the Police Commission, where they're looking at bias in policing with a former police chief, and he's got some wonderful people from the advocacy community, Brian Stevenson, Connie Rice, who used to be with us, and they are engaged in a series of hearings. They are taking evidence. We've testified. I believe the record is open in case anybody wants to submit testimony. They are trying to kind of wrap up their recommendations in a hurry. They just had 90 days, which is actually a very short period for a presidential commission. And it's obvious from that that I think they really want to do business. I think that recommendations that come out of there, because there is such buy-in from local electeds and hopefully police unions, that there will be some real mechanisms for adopting change. I think, you know, some of this has to be voluntary. Some of this has to be where, you know, what police forces are going to want to engage in. So I think that kind of holds out some promise for kind of getting that conversation going and giving some very concrete direction to the police agencies who hopefully want to make some changes. So the other thing that the president did is to issue this executive order about the military equipment, and you know, that is it is very important. It is also a place that Congress initially weighed in at the very beginning. They held hearings on the militarization of the police. But I have to tell you that when all that happened, I mean, it certainly was necessary because of what we were seeing on TV and what you all were living in terms of your experience. But to me, it was like it was like just touching kind of the beginning of the issue, because we're really talking about how police responded to protests that were responding to something else. And we were talking about kind of the militarization and using, you know, the tanks or the tear gas or something. I mean, that's not what brought Michael Brown down. I mean, that Michael Brown was just shot with, I don't know what the, you know, the weapon was. But it is very important that we keep our eyes on the underlying problems. And I think while, you know, we weighed in with testimony on the militarization issue, and in particular with the 1033 program, which shockingly, I think to everybody, revealed that yes, we do use military weapons on our school campuses, not only in colleges, but the K through 12 level, which is just appalling, and it's something that we have called upon Congress and the administration to cease immediately, because there's absolutely no excuse for that, given all the problems with the school-to-prison pipeline. It just exacerbates an already very tense situation in terms of school climate. But I just, you know, I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize. And I am actually very concerned about whether, you know, is Congress going to do anything in response to what happened to Michael Brown? You know, we talk about kind of all the focus on the Justice Department, but there is a role for Congress. Congress could change some rules if they wanted to in terms of funding, in terms of oversight. There's a racial profiling bill that has been pending for a very long time that amazingly did not even move after this. But again, the racial profiling is at kind of one point of the criminal justice process. It's not about necessarily use of force. It's about the initial stop. And so what are we doing, Congress, to talk about what really happened on that street that day? And I think that it's incumbent upon us, everybody, the organizations, the community groups that are working this incredible movement that has been generated, to say to Congress, this is we want some response here. And it's not only the feds, and it's not only at the local level when we're talking about, or state level, when we're talking about like changing the way that the prosecutors are appointed, which I think is important, but I really think we need to focus on something that Congress can do. So those are kind of just kind of the high points of what we've been doing at the Legal Defense Fund. We are so happy to be collaborating with so many of our old and new friends. And I've been working in civil rights advocacy at the federal level for a very long time, and it's so wonderful to have this energy on the ground kind of coming up, and we very much look forward to working with you and kind of joining and in moving these reforms. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to once again give everyone a round of applause for coming out. Thank you. Are there any questions that you have? Yes.
It was mentioned earlier about just a few different points that, in my mind, seem to relate. There was the issue of the federal government giving communities money the police force's money that's supposed to go towards the community, and there was also the issue of, in Ferguson in particular, of the police force not being very representative of the community that they were meant to serve and protect. So I guess my question is kind of twofold. One, in high schools, you see a lot of military recruiters, people trying to bring kids in to join the military when they turn 18. So I guess my first question is, would it be possible in different communities to reach out to these to kids in high school and try and recruit them to the police force, and would that be helpful, or are there any bars on that? And actually, I'll leave it there.
I was going to say something briefly. I'm sure everyone else will want to weigh in as well. We're all calling for reforms here, and I think it is important to assert that myself, I know none of us are anti-police. I think that you have to humanize them as well. And to be honest, I'm someone who, before I was a law professor, I was very much someone who had negative interactions with police throughout my life. But then I had a case where there was a person who had molested a child, and the police officer had done an investigation, and I think without their willingness to put themselves on the line, this was a 5-year-old little girl, she would still be in harm's way. So it changed the way I look at police, and I think police, there can be a model of policing that is in line with human rights. There has to be a human rights ideal of policing. Police spend more of their time ideally helping people than using force. And so it ought to be something that high school students should be proud to engage in. After saying all that, the people, I know for me, the way that the military has historically recruited in high schools, to me, has been a problem. I think oftentimes they go to low-income communities, they use economic incentives, and people fail to keep in mind that they're putting their lives on the line, and they're putting themselves in harm's way, and sometimes they make decisions that rich kids wouldn't make because of the economic, I'd say, coercion that's happening. So I would never want to mimic this dynamic through policing and just double down on it. So the president has now proposed a junior college or community college route for people who can't afford it. And I think that's something that I'd prefer over policing or the military for high schoolers. So it's a much better option, and we should be thinking of maybe making that junior college training mandatory before people become police, because we need police officers to have exposure to the university, be able to experience the diversity and the education that will then inform the way they interact with our communities, as opposed to people who don't have that exposure, people who are, sometimes militarized, coming out of the Army without new training, so that they look at, there was a situation in Miami where police had put up a picture of 6 or 7 black men and used it for target practice. And that's the type of culture that we're dealing with. So if we want to alter that culture, maybe we need to increase the educational requirements necessary for police as opposed to recruiting on the high school level.
Can I, just because I want to touch on something that you were saying. I just want to concretize some of the things that Justin said, because I really agree with a lot of the points that he was making. So one of the data issues that we have around policing is really comparing different police departments to one another. But there are a couple of things that we kind of anecdotally know for sure, that some departments pay really decently. Like, you can actually support a family on a police officer's salary. I'm thinking about New England, Massachusetts, Vermont. The situation you have in St. Louis County that, and again, not to other St. Louis County because there's so many places, you have a situation where people can actually make more money working at Target and Walmart often than they can as a police officer. So you're making, somewhere around $10, $12 an hour. You have 600 hours of training, and you're sent out there with a 9mm with the kind of tacit idea that your job is to stop as many people as you can and make these arrests, because the revenue then goes back to the municipality. And so there's like Marbury was saying, there's a real incentive to profile. One of the things that's being talked about in Congress right now that I think is really being pushed are these mandatory minimums, if you will, minimum qualifications to be a police officer. I mean, this also has to do with pay, right? So in some ways, and I just taught a course here in DC, and I was talking with someone who was formerly in the military and has many of his brothers are in the police force, and talking about how you really have, in many cases, poor white men that are put up against poor black men. I mean, it's a perfect storm in a way, and to blame individual police officers without really looking at the structure that people are being put in is a real disservice. So I actually agree with the idea that there should be recruitment, but I think the whole structure has to change. And then I'll just put in my 2 last things, which was one of the things that we do know is that racial profiling among police happens regardless of the race of the police officer. So black police officers are racially profiling black individuals as well. And so that, once again, goes back to structure. Also, and I don't know if you all read this, but this really was startling to me, that a study was done in New York where 90% of the black police officers reported being racially profiled by their brethren, and sisterin, I suppose, but by their fellow police officers while off duty. And so again, structure. But I would love to see a day where someone, Mike Brown could have been a police officer if given certain opportunities, if given a structure whereby he would have been welcomed into that.
So I think speak to Justin and Nicole's point, and also a bit to your question, but what are the points? New York City had a very interesting experience after the kind of protest that happened there, and then after there were 2 police who were unfortunately shot in Brooklyn. The police department went on a protest themselves and refused to do their job, in quotes, but really what that meant was they stopped doing broken windows policing. And broken windows policing is an idea around policing that I'm sure you all know, but the idea is that if you punish very low level, often non-criminal offenses, you can prevent more serious crime. And at this point, it takes up a majority of NYPD's job, and not just in New York, it also is in Los Angeles, it's in DC, it's in St. Louis, it's almost every place. And it very often is the kind of pretext to many of these stops. So both Michael Brown, Eric Garner, it was the reason why police officers can approach folks who are doing nothing wrong and begin an interaction is because of broken windows policing. And so for about 3.5 weeks, the New York Police Department stopped arresting folks for low-level offenses. Arrests went down over 70%. Crime did not go up. But there was this kind of like this moment, and a lot of police officers, both retired and not retired, spoke out and said, like, I didn't become a cop to stop brown and black folks on the street. That was not why I wanted to do this job. I thought this was about safety, it's about protecting, it was about kind of being of service. And instead, my job has become this kind of quota-driven, arrest-driven, harassment-driven, right? And so I think it was an interesting moment for us in New York who have been kind of campaigning against this very discriminatory type of policing, to have police officers say, like, we didn't even want to do this, like, this wasn't even our thing. And so I think to the point of what police do and don't do and what they want to do and not want to do, I think there's a real need for a conversation about both what communities want, but also what police departments and police officers outside of this system that incentivizes both in terms of like municipal revenue and finance, so that like municipalities put pressure, even New York City, who gets more than $800 million a year off of summonses and violations, puts pressure on departments to create quotas and incentives for officers to harass and arrest folks in brown and black communities. And so there's this kind of trickle-down effect. That was a Reagan moment. There's this kind of trickle-down effect where really the like, interest of communities and police officers is disregarded for this kind of systemic continuation and this entrenched system. And so I think those questions, like what really should police officers be doing? And the second question, to Justin's point of like who should be police officers? I mean, we decided that folks who used to be in the Army should be police officers as opposed to social workers or teachers. Like, who is it who should be in charge of keeping safety and order? And so this kind of vague question, I think, for me, I've been really interested in the idea, because I think there really is, it's like a populist moment. Where, like, we see both poor black and brown folks and poor white folks go into this field, which is really like, they don't get paid very much, right? They have jobs that are dangerous, and they don't have always like greater benefits. They're very often like employed at will in some place. Like there's a lot of issues, like it's a union / like employment labor issue that police face outside of these systems that reinforce racist policing practices. And so the question of like, what if we had a system that professionalized police, where you got paid a lot more money, but there were a lot less police, and kind of what like the focus of their job would be about safety, as opposed to about these kind of entrenched systems that are about profit and they're about like control, right? So the first SWAT team was out of Los Angeles to destroy the Black Panthers, and the first, military, like, that we see these things are rooted in very historical moments around social control of race and class. And so how do we remove ourselves from that? I think the question of who are police and what they do is an important one, and those places where police interests and a community interests really do align, and that's been made invisible, I think, by kind of the ways that these systems work.
So just to be the fourth person weighing in on this, just from a civil rights kind of enforcement perspective, you have to you look at the numbers and the first question is, what's going on with the selection procedures?
Mm-hmm.
What are the specifics? Part of the selection procedures involve recruitment. Where are they doing their recruitment? Are they doing recruitment enough in order to kind of capture African American and Latino and other communities of colors, just in terms of applications? I mean, the Legal Defense Fund historically has represented many African American police officers who were either trying to get hired by police forces really since the beginning of the Civil Rights Act, or getting fired on trumped-up charges, or disciplined for racial reasons. So it's something that we've kind of have in our kind of employment discrimination docket over time. But I think as local agencies kind of look to see whether they are in compliance with civil rights laws, beginning with civil rights laws, but also kind of taking all these steps to make sure that they don't, they're not the next Ferguson. I mean, a starting point is looking at the composition of your force. and kind of, figuring out if I were, Ferguson, something is very amiss here in terms of who we are serving, the communities we are serving, and the complexion of the force. And so it raises civil rights questions immediately in the minds of a civil rights lawyer looking at that.
Yes?
I didn't know if it was time for questions. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all of your insights. I teach civil rights law here, and I'm sort of asked this question in part because some of my students are here as well. One of the things that we've been looking at is the Section 1983 litigation, and I'm wondering from Professor Hansford, you had mentioned lawsuits that you're bringing against the police officers and the municipalities. Are those the Section 1983 cases, or what's been sort of your focus in terms of litigation that you've brought so far?
Well, so and Nicole can speak on this as well. Ferguson Legal Defense Committee has primarily began the litigation around the response to the protests. So the TRO against the police for the use of tear gas and the way they were deploying the tear gas without giving warnings to people was the first cut for when you talk about affirmative litigation on the ground. Before that, it was all about defensive litigation, trying to protect protesters, trying to bail people out who had been protesting, trying to respond to the unconstitutional demands put on the protesters by the police. At one point, they had a rule called the 5-second rule, where if anyone stopped marching for 5 seconds at a time, they'd be under arrest. And no one to this day really knows where they got that from, but it was clearly an encumbrance on their First Amendment rights, according to the federal judge, and it was ruled unconstitutional. So that was a lawsuit the ACLU actually brought. So far, we've just created an organization called Plea for Justice, which is designed to bring lawsuits against police for these specific incidents of harassment. So it is more targeted towards what you're getting at, bringing some of these cases to really, I don't want to say flood the courts, but flood the courts with these lawsuits to demonstrate that these are not specific incidents that happen every once in a while. Even 28 hours is too long of a period, because young people of color, black and brown communities, are being harassed, or being targeted, or being assaulted, or being insulted, and it's happening on a daily basis. And so bringing those types of lawsuits, that's something that we have planned in the future. So, there are models out there that we're looking at. Of course, New York has a great model. In fact, the Floyd case is a great model for, again, a sort of a more systematic approach, taking a LDF a strategy of having an impact litigation and trying to bring some widespread transformation based on a representative case like that. So all those things are on the table. But so the organization that is going to be bringing this lawsuit has only been in existence for a week or two, and we're still trying to raise funds and move forward. You want to chime in on that? Or?
I can briefly say, so in New York City, we have the Floyd lawsuit as well as the Davis lawsuit. And Floyd was a stop-and-frisk case, so it was a 1983 stop-and-frisk case around the illegal NYPD practice and pattern of stopping folks unconstitutionally. And the Davis case, which just preliminarily got settled, was a case around public housing. So in public housing in New York City, they enforce trespassing laws for folks who live in public housing. So if you are in your own home, they will arrest you if you don't have an ID that proves your residence in that home, which is and disturbing. And so as part of that process, it was just recently settled. The first case was not settled. There was a long trial. I think this goes to your point about data. Data was ascension. In fact, LDF, I think, is on the Davis case, right? Yeah. So you can speak more about that. But it's been, one of the interesting things that came out of that case was, so there was a series of immediate orders, including body cameras, which I think is problematic. But there also is, they invested or engaged in, and this happened in Cincinnati as well as a result of a 1983 lawsuit in Cincinnati, in a joint remedial process, which y'all should know what that means. And essentially, it's going to be a 6 to 9 month process where community members and other stakeholders, including the unions, CPR, which is the group of activists in New York City, will engage in a collaborative process to have a series of recommendations for policy reform around stop and frisk and trespass laws. But really, because it also gets to consent to search and other constitutional violations that the NYPD has engaged in, it will be kind of a larger remedies process. And one more point to that is there was a similar lawsuit called Daniels, which happened more than a decade ago, which kind of found similarly that there was violations happening by the NYPD of constitutional rights across the city, and they were discriminatory. And I think what you saw was that the court said, like, this is the problem, here's the remedies, do it, and in fact nothing happened with it. And so the kind of necessity of community involvement and of like having a remedial process that involves communities and having kind of whether or not it's successful being evaluated by communities is so essential, and like whether or not what happens in the courts becomes a reality in the streets, right? So I think that kind of combination, as you mentioned, is the groundswell of energy becomes an accountability mechanism for folks who litigate these cases and win.
Yeah, just, I think about these two numbers that I shared with you. The Justice Department in the last 5 years has filed 20 pattern and practice, and then I also mentioned there are 18,000 discrete police agencies, and you see the disconnect there. I mean, it's really important that private lawyers, legal organizations, historic civil rights organizations are willing to step into that role of what we call private attorneys general and prosecute these cases. I mean, from a civil rights framework, there are not enough lawyers who know how to bring 1983 cases. You have these ones that we can all mention and talk about that have been lifted up, but we really need to be doing some, in my view, training of lawyers about this type of thing so that it's not left up to the Justice Department and legal organizations like the Legal Defense Fund, and even kind of the organizations that you're kind of putting together now, because there's so many potential lawsuits out there to file. And the other thing, you raise a really good point about the consent decrees in the cases that have been negotiated by the Justice Department or private lawyers. That I think what's happening now is people are using the provisions of those consent decrees as kind of the models for voluntary compliance in other areas, in other jurisdictions, because it's something that they're kind of like, well, this type of training should be done. So it's really kind of even getting in there before there are actual violations to speak of and to sue over, that it's important to use those as models. And so we really should be looking at the Cincinnati's, or I guess it was Cleveland, but Cincinnati a while ago, Cleveland most recently, about what are some of those provisions, and hopefully getting these local agencies to adopt those things before they get sued.
Right. Go ahead.
I was going to put a plug in for economic rights in these court cases.
After you do that, well, before you do that,
go for it.
real quick, this sparked a few things in my mind. We did have a number of conversations about bringing these lawsuits against police departments. Now, don't forget, St. Louis County is an outlier in a sense, but it also demonstrates your point. There are over 50 police departments in this county of 900,000 people. Some police departments are as small as 10 to 15 police for a city of 5,000. Ferguson is one of the bigger ones with 50, 60 police officers. So if you bring these lawsuits to try to create change on a departmental level, you're really just chipping away at a mountain, and it's not the most effective use of resources. The hope is that departments voluntarily adopt these collaborative agreements, and you're setting some precedent. Cincinnati, New York, they have other models out there, but again, I'm not terribly optimistic that these departments are going to voluntarily engage in this reform unless there's some sort of threat of something that's going to penalize them if they don't. So I think this is one of those areas where as an attorney you have to look at all your tools in your toolbox and really ask yourself if litigation is the best tool or the first cut, and maybe part of an arsenal, if so to speak. but it may not be the first thing to look at. So.
What I was going to say is one of the things in St. Louis County they are looking at, though, in terms of using the tool of lawsuits, is really attaching as much punitive measures as possible in terms of damages. Arch City Defenders, in particular, that I've been working with a lot, they just filed some lawsuits around the economic impact that the constant warrants and constant fines are having on individuals. So individuals are actually basically bringing quasi-civil suits, if you will. I lost my job because I couldn't pay a fine and you kept me in jail for 3 weeks. And these jails are not equipped to keep people even overnight, many of them. So I mean, you have human rights violations, you have certainly the economic violations as well. So really looking at it not just from the traditional things that we think about, but also thinking about, the right to work, the right to health, all those things that, us human rights folks like to talk about. And to that end, one of the things that I'm seeing, and I think that this is a really important moment, and we did this in the TRO, is we're not actually just using local and national law anymore. I mean, we're accusing people of violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And some judges think it's crazy, and some judges are like, ooh. Like, it has an impact to think about. Like, we are not only in violation of our local and national laws, we're actually in violation of laws that we make, and just pick a country that we make them accountable for. So what does it look like for us not to be accountable? And I actually think that's the right move. Like in 10 years, I think it's going to be much more acceptable to talk about international law and actually will really bolster our cases. So for those of you that are going to become lawyers, I mean, you're kind of at the cusp of it. So it's a fairly interesting time. And then the last thing I just wanted to put a plug in about something I'm very concerned about nationally, which is how demonstrators are being arrested and they are being prosecuted, under criminal statutes. They're also getting civil charges against them. So we see this in the BART case right now in Oakland, where protesters, chain themselves to a train, and now they're being, not only is there criminal charges, but are they still being sued for $70,000? I'm not sure if BART has decided, but they're really trying to hammer home. In the pleadings around the Mall of America case, not only is it criminal and civil charges, but then you come to find out that actually a police officer was embedded with the group from the very inception of the movement. Meaning, it's not just like they were infiltrated by the police, and we saw this in New York around the RNC that one time. The police officers are actually going undercover in these movements and are very much a part of the planning, only then to turn around and be a state witness. So there's a lot, as civil rights attorneys, there's a lot to be really concerned about, and we are on the defensive, I think, in a lot of these demonstrator cases, but I think we're going to have to turn that around very soon.
Could I just raise one more issue? Because these are public agencies, they're required to hand over kind of information about their practices and policies, not completely, but certainly more so than if they were like a private employer or a private actor. And so, we filed some FOIA requests. I think other organizations have. And it's a real great opportunity, I think, for local advocacy in terms of finding out specifically what the policies and practices are of those 18,000 agencies. Yeah. And then, do they comport with some of the consent decree remedial provisions that have been adopted in some of these? And then there you go. There's an advocacy, like, this is what we would like you to do. It looks like you're not doing this right now. And then, you compare, and it seems to me that that's a real kind of model that you could use. Again, going to Justin's point, that there are just not enough lawyers to bring all these lawsuits, even if you could prove the violations.
To the protests, I hope the BART guys get sued, and I'm sorry, but as a group that's trying to gain sympathy and gain understanding, chaining yourselves to a public transit device and preventing every other person out there, inconveniencing every other person to get your message across, that's no different than chaining yourself to the red line here. I know people in San Francisco who were getting off a 14-hour OBGYN shift at the hospital whose replacement was on that BART train. She was stuck in that hospital for 3 extra hours because they chained themselves to it. Their replacement couldn't get to the hospital in time. I mean, I feel like there has to be some sense of personal responsibility in how you're going about to get this message out there. The actual question I was looking for, you've all put yourselves out there as leaders in this field, and particularly on police use of force and things like that, and combating it. I'm curious, which of you have participated in law enforcement shoot, don't shoot trainings?
Well, would you explain what those are? Law enforcement shoot,
Law
don't shoot.
enforcement shoot, don't shoot trainings is it's the trainings all officers have to go through, and civilians can as well. It's the trainings where they do active shooter training where you decide if you're going to shoot or not shoot in any given situation. The scores usually end up going along the lines of unlawful shoots versus you being dead. I find it interesting that we all sit here and criticize law enforcement for how they act in any situation, yet we haven't gone through those trainings, we haven't seen what they live through, and how many memorial highways and bridges do we pass every day on our commute?
Well, let me.
I was going to take the first part, the Rosa Parks part.
Where do we start?
I just was going to say, look, you know, I've never served in law enforcement. I will say members of my extended family have, so I have great respect for the work that they do. But, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that something is wrong when you have these incidents occurring, events just over and over, that there is not enough training, there is not enough monitoring, there is not enough really digging down into kind of what's motivating people and frankly their fears, their respective fears of these encounters. And I think it goes to stereotyping. I think we have to do a much better job of talking about explicit and implicit bias and figuring out how this is getting to the situation where you have the people that they're sworn to protect are lying dead in the streets. And so, you know, I'm not here to talk about, you know, everything that police should do, but I will say that I think that there is a growing national recognition that something is deeply wrong about the way that we're monitoring the activities of local police, and that something needs to be done very soon about it. And so we want to help. We think that there's a problem, and we're trying to get at the bottom of it and kind of provide the advice that we think needs to be heard.
Well, given the fact that it's February 4th, and that's Rosa Parks' birthday, I will say on the BART, well, let me say this first on the BART issue. So I've got two little girls. They're my heart, 2 and 5. And I had one of those days where I had to be like way out in the burbs, and they go to school, and their nanny's over here. And I got stuck because folks were in the middle of 395, and it was crazy. And of course, my first priority is to my girls. And I was nervous about getting to where I needed to be on time. Pickups are crazy. It's inconvenient for people who it was inconvenient here for people who had major things to do. I will say, with all due respect, the same argument you just made was also made about Rosa Parks. It was also made about the bus boycott years ago, that people were inconvenienced and it was an emergency situation. In fact, the mayor wrote a whole article about how if Negroes did not take the bus, they would not be able to run the system, and therefore that was a public safety issue. You know, I hear that argument. I also hear it historically as well. And so that is why I actually think a part of personal responsibility within an American community is to make sure that all Americans are safe. And right now, not all Americans are safe. And my 2 and 5-year-old are going to grow up in a country that, unfortunately, the people that are paid and trained to protect them may not respect their lives. And for me, that's an unacceptable America.
Yeah. So I'm going to add a little, though I have an amen for that. There was Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a beautiful letter from Birmingham jail that I think speaks to this point about people critiquing the tactics of movements, and that there's a real, and this happens throughout the civil rights movement, of this kind of idea of like, why do this, why now, why so militant, why so, and I think it's really important, and there are organizers and folks who organize those actions in the Bay Area. It's Black Lives Matter and other folks who are incredibly eloquent about articulating why there was an urgency to inconvenience folks in order to shine a light on the incredible desperation of communities that are being shot down and killed in their own streets, and not just that, but also being occupied. And so I think to that response, there was a beautiful article both in, I think Alicia Garza wrote it, that I think speaks directly to your kind of question about why these tactics, and I would also reference the MLK letter, which I think speaks to people's hesitancy around them, but also the need to really be bold and engage in tactics that folks find inconvenient, and kind of the reasons why. To the police point, I would just echo, I think that they're really, I also have never gone through police training. My uncle is a police officer in Philly. My other uncle is in jail in Philly. I think that there's a real, that there are lots of, that I come from a family of both of those experiences. And by no means do I have any lack of respect for police officers or what they do. I think there's a systemic issue that, in fact, more preschoolers were killed by guns last year than police officers, that it's a dangerous job, but the reality is that it's become more dangerous for folks who are being policed in some ways. And I think we really have to engage in that conversation about how we keep ourselves safe, both police officers and communities. But I think that we should, there are lots of memorial bridges to police officers, and there are none to Amali Graham and Mike Brown, which I think speaks to a value about whose lives we value. But I value all lives. I think it's really important that we have a system of policing that protects all lives, both in training and in kind of the ultimate. And also, to that point, I think that we've seen lots of studies that ultimately crime prevention is most successful when it's about education, when it's about opportunity, not when it's about militarized and punitive kind of consequences. And so I agree, I would love to have a safety conversation. I don't think that it's just about police safety, though.
Real quick, that was amazing. I would respond, and I think Marbury elucidated for me the point of your question about the training, which I'm assuming was that police officers fear for their own lives, and I'm assuming that's your point. And so as a result, we should consider their fear when we are making these arguments. And I guess my response would be, I actually don't cast aspersions on the character of people. So if people fear for their lives and they're in an environment where they see a 12-year-old Tamir Rice and they think he will kill them at any moment, or while they're choking Eric Garner, he's on the ground, they're scared to death that he will get up and kill them, or Mike Brown's been shot, but they're scared to death. They said I think Darren Wilson said he looked like a demon. He was going to run through the bullets and kill him. And they may genuinely have these beliefs. And so, we all have to ask ourselves, if I was in their situation, this demon, this superhuman was going to kill me, while being choked, while being shot, maybe that's how I would respond too if I had that belief. And so maybe this is a genuine belief they have in this society. They've been conditioned to believe that these black bodies are so super powerful and such a threat that they will be able to kill in all these impossible situations. It's a sad statement about our society, not them as individuals, because they've been trained to genuinely have these beliefs. And so it's a really huge climb to try to change those belief systems. We have to get there at some point. But in the meantime, we have to put into place the structures so that people can't act on them and take the lives of 12-year-old children whom they believe are threatening their lives when they're playing with toys. Or, so again, the individuals themselves who find themselves situated in this society and have these beliefs implanted into their subconscious. It's like if you were a computer, it's like a virus that's implanted into your brain. You believe these black bodies can do these amazing feats and kill you when they want to kill you. The police officer who sees these individuals as enemy combatants who are in the middle of a war, who are trying to kill them at all times. If I was in that war and I was about to be killed, it's kill or be killed, maybe I would have done the same thing. But it's the it's the thought process that they have that is the problem. But without being able to get to that thought process, we have to depend on these structures, I believe.
Just following up on that point, I know that you all have talked about a lot of the systemic issues that plague our society, but there are also the issues of unfamiliarity that a lot of the prejudice and stereotypes that you all mentioned in passing come from, especially now with the de facto resegregation of schools, a lot of separate communities, a lot of neighborhood or community funding of schools, which leads to a huge disparity in the quality of opportunities that people in public schooling may or may not get. So I guess I was interested in each of your perspectives on what we could do to address those issues as lawyers and as litigators, and how imminent is that we work on those issues as well as working on the issues that you all have already touched on.
Well, I'll take a stab. I think I talked earlier about kind of how we were looking at this holistically, that it isn't just kind of the problems with the criminal justice system, but you could have, a young officer, he was, Darren Wilson was in his 20s, right? I mean, you could conceivably have in this day and age, somebody who lived in a white neighborhood, rarely interacted with the African American community growing up, went to an almost exclusively white school because of the resegregation of schools, had a job at the mall in the white part of town where African American customers rarely went. You could really have somebody who had very little interaction, even in the St. Louis County, in this day and age, with people who didn't look like him. And you get what Justin talked about, kind of this, ideas form in terms of, stereotypes and bias seeps in, and it may be very unconscious, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be addressed. And it's kind of, that's what we're talking about, implicit bias, that you're not, he says, I'm not, it's not like I'm doing things against somebody because of their race, but it's all these other kind of factors kind of seeping into their consciousness. And then there you have it. He gets a job on a police force that is tasked with protecting and serving a community that he's very unfamiliar with. And so I think that happens all the time. I think it's very easy in our segregated society to have somebody to get to their 20s who I don't know if he went to college, but same thing could happen at a junior college. They're still very segregated. And so I think that's what we're talking about, training at the local level and raising consciousness. And it's something that the departments have to be willing to do this too. That's something you can require training, but it also has to be incumbent upon them to kind of want to bring up these issues and want to have these discussions about this.
I guess I just want to add just one thing about like the inertia of life, because you asked particularly about as lawyers, and so I've been a lawyer for a little bit, and I went to a law school, like many law schools, that is majority white, and then there are some minorities. And I would say that it's about being a lawyer. It's also about the type of person you want to be, quite frankly. I know for a fact that I have some friends that I'm probably, if we're lucky, one of two African Americans that they're close to. I think that there's a way in which we all have to decide what we want our life to look like, and that is going to impact how we do our work, how we do our jobs. There's been all these statistics and stories that have come out about how so often many white people don't have any people of color that they can call friends. And Facebook doesn't count. I keep telling people this, Facebook actually does not count, right? And so, to be able to see that perspective, it's very hard to say to Nicole Lee, Black lives don't matter if you've been to my house,
You see my children out in the white with their white picket fence playing with the dog. It's all very hard to do that. It's easy to do that if you don't have those connections. If you really only know people that you've seen on TV or you interact with in stressful situations like at banks and the grocery store and whatnot. So it really is about the type of life you want to lead and how much truth you really want to know. As an African American, my experience is not, just essentialized just because I'm a minority in this country. I have to, if I want to live a life that is free of bias, interact with people and make a life that is deliberately poised to interact with people that are different from me. I'm straight, right? I could live in this heterosexist bubble my whole life and say that my situation is essential. But I don't do that. And I don't do that in part because I have some really cool friends, but I also don't do that because that's not the type of life I want to lead. And I think it really is a part of your values. It's not just about being a good lawyer. It's about being a decent human being that wants to understand not only other people's joys that are different from you, but really understand their pain and understand that their situation is also essential and their lives also matter. That's my thought on it.
So I feel like you get to two really important points, and one of them is about the kind of de facto segregation that we live in, which I think is a class and a race thing. But though people have such different experiences of this country, of police, of education, of criminal justice, that there really is. In New York City, when de Blasio was still spouting progressive talk, he talked about a tale of two cities. That there really is people's lived experiences based on race, based on class, is so epically different, and there really is, sometimes it's hard to get a window into that experience. When I first went to college, I went to Columbia, and I was all of a sudden exposed to these folks who had lived in upstate New York and had these incredibly wealthy experiences that I didn't even know that existed as a phenomenon, and had taken Latin in high school, and I was like, oh my God, it was a whole new world in some ways. And I think that the reality that we live in a country where there are different tracks of experiences. When I say that black communities are occupied, half the folks are like, occupied? What do you mean? And what I mean is, in Brooklyn, on every block, there are 4 police officers who stop you for no reason. And that's not true when I go to Westchester. It's not that it's a different experience than Manhattan. And so I think, to your point, that although Jim Crow and black laws are no longer in place, we still have very, very different tracks for America, but based both on race and class. And so for me, that's a profound point. And I think that folks who don't live in kind of the privileged sphere are often rendered invisible. And so folks who I met at Columbia were like, wait, I'm sorry, you come, what does that mean? They had no idea of my experiences either. And so I think you're right about the power of sharing experiences and elevating experiences that may not be your own. And to that point as well, I think from the legal point of view, we talked a bit about kind of the visionary demands, ending the school to prison pipeline and housing for all. And it's because the ways in which criminal justice and mass criminalization interact on the bodies of black and brown people is not just about when the police stop you, right? It's about being evicted because your son had weed. It's about not having an education that gets you opportunities. It's about, instability of job. All of those things play into the reality of poverty and blackness in America. And so, amen, my grandmother, may she rest in peace, used to say you have to put your hands in the soil where you stand. And I think that's a really profound point about whatever it is that draws your passion as a lawyer, there is so much to be done. And there are so many ways we really do have a mountain. And we have a system that's been built on exploitation, and we have to really be engaged in ending that. And so I think whatever interests you have to kind of dig in and be about that for your law career.
Marcus, let us ask a question, because we are way over.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Sure.
I just had a comment, for what it matters, because he left, but I just wanted to, I don't know, it's kind of disturbing for me for somebody to say that just because somebody has gone through experiences in law enforcement, that's almost like an excuse, because it's not justified in law enforcement either. And I don't know, I was just kind of drawing a parallel, if somebody grows up in a racist environment, or even if in law enforcement they're taught that it's okay to go out and profile blacks and do things like this. I don't know, I just don't see that as an excuse, and it's almost like I was drawing a parallel with people who are in the military and they're taught that all Middle Eastern people are dangerous. I'm actually Middle Eastern and my brother is in the military. So for me to even think that my brother would ever go to war and come back with that sort of mindset, I wouldn't be able to live in a house like that. So I feel like I don't know, like, he was just saying, like, oh, you don't know what they've been through, but they shouldn't be going through that either, so I feel like it is something that needs to be fixed from within.
Right.
And maybe I'm biased because I went to a very diverse, actually like elementary through high school and even college, so I'm very open-minded, and not all people are blessed with that, so.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I agree with you 100%. I don't think it's an excuse, but I think there are black, so we talked about the black police officers who engage in as much racial profiling, if not more racial profiling, than white police officers. And, you know, I do think that when you think about implicit bias and this idea that people don't intentionally set out to have the fears they have or see the what to us are clearly unreasonable threats in children, you know, I do think it's a good ethical question as to how much to blame them. I don't think it lets them off the hook because they have to change, especially when they're taking other people's lives on the grounds of those unreasonable beliefs. But the question of how much to blame them to me is a tough question. How much to blame the person who has unconscious bias, who once they figure out that they have unconscious bias would be willing to engage in that consciousness raising to make the change, but they just haven't been challenged yet. Nobody like us has sat down and challenged them to their face yet. And once we do that, maybe they'll change, but they haven't been challenged yet. That person, to me, has a certain level of ethical stature. I don't know a better word to put it, but as opposed to the people who are just willingly ignoring the clearly racist implication of their actions. Police Chief Jackson, or you know, someone like Bull Connor. You know, that to me, those are moral, ethical parallels, right? People who have heard the arguments and just completely disregard them. That's different than someone who is unexposed.
Just to follow up, so I respect that's a very fair argument. My issue is just where do you draw the line?
Yeah,
because
right.
it's a very fine line, and I don't know, in my mind it's just always kind of an excuse, and I don't know if it's because, I don't know, crimes are crimes. So in the legal system,
Right. They don't
it doesn't
care.
really matter, like, oh, I was brought up this way or something like that.
But
I
it
guess
just
I
matters.
yeah, I guess I would just say that, you know, it may be that people have those unconscious biases, but in my view, they don't belong on the police force. You know, I mean, I think that's what we're saying. That's what we've got to have, some mechanism that those folks don't get on and that they don't stay on if they're acting, if they're manifesting that in such a way with tragic consequences like this. And so I think that's what we're talking about. When we talk about training, we're talking about, okay, you have the police force that you have now. You know, let's make sure that we're getting at that issue with the officers you have now. But I think there's kind of this additional issue. You need to have some procedures in place to make sure that you're not recruiting people that kind of bring that to the job. We're never going to, unfortunately, within our lifetimes, kind of eliminate that problem in terms of people walking around with explicit or implicit bias. But our thing is, how do we get the police forces to be rid of folks like that who should have no place in law enforcement? I don't think anybody would say that they do.
Right.
I think everybody agrees with that, and I think that's the problem. What are the steps that we take to ensure that?
Thank you.
All right, last comment.
Just real quick, partly directed to the NAACP, but also I would like everybody to weigh if they could. I know historically that when lynching was going on, the NAACP would put a flag outside of its office notifying the public that a lynching had taken place. Has there been any discussion to bring that flag back to the equivalent of
I like that.
deadly force has been used, and not even as a condemnation on police conduct, just the idea that we were talking about our civil rights class, it halts due process. And then I guess to you guys, do you think it's necessary? Is that step necessary? Because I mean, and I don't think that's an inconvenience to protest like that, but that's a way to raise awareness. And it sounds like the flag would never be taken down currently. You know,
Yeah.
so-
What kind of
Yes,
flag
go for
was
it.
it? You know, I don't know whether that, we're technically the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I don't know about the flag in particular, but I will say that we've discussed that the notion that kind of these events don't go kind of unaccounted in terms of when they happen and how we publicly, in the absence of data, kind of talk about that. And I think it was, I can't remember who it was historically who really made it. I think is it who?
Ida B. Wells?
Yeah, Ida B. Wells actually made sure that like that was publicly known. And I mean, that's what we're trying to do, you know, in this era with the data. I mean, it should be something that's reported and just as importantly, to see how it was resolved, because there are a lot of ongoing investigations that nobody has any idea whether they're over or what the result was. And that's incredibly frustrating from kind of a law enforcement perspective ourselves. Like, where is the accountability if you can't even look to see if this investigation is still pending?
I asked an intern I gave a speech on MLK to just, get together a list for me of all the unarmed African Americans, men or women, that have been killed by law enforcement, just law enforcement, over the last 3 years. And it was, to read it would have taken up about a fourth of the speech. So I basically picked different people out. And even I work on this, and I just couldn't believe some of the cases that just have never come to the light. I mean, Romali Graham was like a highlighted one. There's so many. So I'm for the flag. I'll make a flag if someone could find out what the flag looked like. I mean, I'm for that, because there has to be some accounting while all this is going on. There has to be some accounting.
So I agree. I'll also make a flag on the way down. I think I've heard folks talk about the idea of like taking to the streets whenever there's a new killing, which I think gets to the same point of like how often would be in the streets. But I think that the idea of like making visible these things that, they happen in small towns in Ohio and in New York City. Like the idea, like how do we even get that information and how do we elevate? I think social media is an amazing job of that. Like on my news feed, almost every morning there's something tragic that's happened. The other, to your point, which I think is really powerful, about not just remembering that it happened, but also tracking it. In New York City, we've started to try and figure out what happened to police officers involved in those shootings. And we've looked into 15 cases in the last, I think it's 3 or 4 years of shootings, not all ending in death, but just unprovoked shootings. And almost all those officers minus one still have their job. And so the idea, even aside from the criminal justice system, which is so broken, but even internally looking at like whether or not police get to keep their job after they unjustifiably shoot an armed civilian, I think is a really powerful thing that because of FOIA and FOIL we have access to in some cases. But just to kind of add on that, yes, flags, I agree.
Yep, real short, yes, flags, 3 flag makers here. And it's all about showing that Black Lives Matter, right? So, the real question is, are flags enough?
Yeah.
You ought to be doing a lot more than just raising the flag in one area. There ought to be, I think that's why we saw this huge transformational shift, because suddenly it seemed like these killings were happening and people cared and they were doing something. And that's what makes Black Lives Matter, when you say that this will have a consequence. It won't just be something that peters out below the headlines. And you make people pay attention, and you make people use resources to respond. So waving a flag, people may just say, oh, that's nice, and keep going. I'm not sure that's the end all be all. It ought to be something that makes them use resources so this protest, say whatever the gentleman thinks of these protests, but they've had to spend millions of dollars to try to respond to this on the local level, on the national level. We did, the Black Friday, 7% of the national expected sales were lost. Those were real consequences, so it was much better than putting a flag up. And so when there are consequences, then people respond, and financial consequences especially make people respond. So yes for the flag, but no, it's not enough.
Let me just say this. you know, in no other area of civil rights do you have such a lack of information. When you think about voting and the census, we know exactly, you know, who lives where, who votes, you know, where, which communities vote. When you think about housing, same thing, you're using the census. When you think about employment, federal, you know, federal contractors, federal government, even private employers keep, you know, statistics that look at the composition of their force. You think about school desegregation cases. You have to know the race of the students in order to see whether the school is desegregated properly. And then you come to this issue, and there's just nothing at the national level that is recording this at all. When in this issue we're talking about the loss of life and people getting physically, you know, harmed. And it's just really incredulous that kind of we're so far kind of from these other areas just in terms of civil rights enforcement.
Amen.
All right.
Oh,
Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank everybody for coming out.
it was lovely.
Yeah, that's epic.
You can call it with them.
I guess. Oh, I'm not.
Why do you invite your cousins over here? Invite your cousins.